pillar. So we'll start out real simple, make a cube, make it a little bit smaller. And what we're going to be aiming to use this time is the collide. So here's my plan. Let's make a basic emitter and scoot this back in space, make it very small. And yes, constantly emit, but I'm going to drop it down to something like 10. So you can see we'll just get a little burst of particles every once in a while, happening forever. Right-clicking on that, I'm going to add an animation vibrate tag, and let's get some rotation going on here. I don't want too much amplitude, but I think we want a decent amount on X, Y, Z. So yeah, we got a lot of vertical rotation, but let's slow this way down like 0.5. So you can see I've kind of got a bunch of bullets flying out from this thing, constantly shooting. Let's give ourselves a bunch more frames. And what we'd like to do is start colliding these particles against the wall. So pretty simple. Let's right click on the cube, say simulation collider, and let's hit play. But you'll see the particles are going to fly right through the object. It's not colliding. That's because we need this collide modifier. So we activate that, drop it inside our particle group, and by default, we could exclude things, but it's going to see everything. And right now, it's set to bounce 100% off the surface. So let's see what happens. Let's also make the particles a little bit bigger for easier visibility. So now you can see the particles are bouncing right off the surface. Excellent. Perfect. Exactly what we wanted to happen. Perfect particles flying, bouncing right off there. Boing, 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 boing. Excellent. So now let's go inside the collide and take a look at the settings. So we've got some options here. We can collide with the object. We can kill the particle. So now when the particle collides, it just dies by colliding, which could be useful. And then we've got repel. So now we just have this bounce force. And I think, is there a radius of some sort? Let's see. Let's hit play. I'm not even sure what repel does. I haven't played with it. Yeah, maybe that, yeah, repel based on something. Intersection is not very powerful, but if we give it a radius by changing that to radius, I think we'll start seeing that is going to, yeah, you can see it's curving away. So definitely repel works better with radius. So that's kind of neat. So yeah, those are our three modes: collide, kill, and repel. So now let's go back to our contact. So when do we want to make contact? I want to make contact when they intersect, or we can set that based on a radius from the surface. So you can see right there, they're bouncing straight off of it. Or you can do both, where it's trying to check if they're intersecting or if they've gotten within a radius and then they just bounce straight off of it. So yeah, that's pretty straightforward. Then we've got our bounce, like maybe we don't want them bouncing. Maybe they just strike the surface and they're not going to have too much energy coming off of there. We've got dynamic friction. This isn't going to, you're not going to see that very well here. Maybe if this was sliding along the ground, but we're bouncing off a pillar. So we'll deal with that later. And then we've also got some variation that will go along well with the bounce, where they'll get a bunch of variation in the way that they are ricocheting off of that surface. So yeah, very straightforward settings here, but there is a cool little rig I want to show you. So this one's a little bit more project-based, but let's see how it goes. You can see that there is something called the target group here. Essentially, this collide can act as a condition, but the only condition it can do is switching particles to another group. So why don't we make an empty group? I'm going to make a particle group, and we'll just call this one collided. So when the particles collide, they will swap to this collided group. When they're in this collided group, I want to make sure that I know that they did. So let's swap their color. So we can grab a color mapper and say, hey, change your color based on the age of whatever, and drop this out so they'll turn red. So let's see if they turn red when they strike the surface. Fire, 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 and boop, 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 they turn red. Let's make them a little bit bigger again so we can see them. Excellent. So those now swap to a different group when that happens. So now that they're in a different group, we can give those all sorts of new behaviors, like let's remove all the speed. So I'm going to say when that strikes, I want to use math after the color's been changed. What I'd like to do is assign the velocity speed to 0. So they should just stop dead when they hit the surface as soon as they swap the group. So those are going to bounce, change color, and they just stick perfectly. Excellent. Exactly what I wanted to happen. Now, I think what I'd like to do is let's make a reproduce. So, and that's why I wanted to cover those reproduce before we did this. I'm going to say, let's make a reproduce. We got a brand new group here, move it down. I might even grab the word reproduce and put it into put particle group reproduce, just so I'm not mixing those up. So when do I want this to execute? Well, I'm going to drop it inside of this collided, and this is going to now apply to all of those always. So I'm going to say, yeah, but per particle, I want you to do a big old burst of particles. So we'll say like 22 particles, and then kill the source. So every single frame, every single one of these collided particles is going to explode into a whole bunch of particles. That seems like it would be dangerous, but it's not going to be, because every one of these is just getting turned into this type of particle for a second. The instant it gets turned, it's going to change color, stop dead, and then reproduce, and that will kill the particle. So what we should get is a little burst of particles every time one of these strikes the wall. So if I hit play, we should see that we get a nice little boop, 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 boop. And we're getting these particles, but they're flying through the wall. So I should change my reproduce, the direction, to be random. I want it to be in all directions. And I think we could probably tell that also to be colliding. So let's drop a collide inside of our reproduce as well and see if those actually bounce off the wall. So we hit play. Now we'll hit these particles and we're getting a giant explosion of them. So why are we getting an explosion of particles? I paused very quickly because that could be dangerous. So the reproduce is supposed to kill the particle from the source. It is creating 22 particles, and we are limited to the collided particle. So if that is killing the particle, then why is it continuing to make them? Oh, I know why that's happening. It's happening because these new particles are colliding with the wall and being told to go into the collided group. So I'm going to click on the collide and stop them from changing the group. Okay, good. Inside that reproduce, we should probably limit their lifetime. So I'll say that they only live for, let's say, 7 frames, very quick. So now we'll try that again. And now we get the bullets to fly out, and the bullets will now strike the wall. Boom, there's a little burst of particles, and everything is fine. We just get that lovely little burst. But I don't want the reproduce to actually kill the particle. So let's turn off kill source, and you'll see that it's going to only emit these particles one time. So that's excellent. That means I can hit play, and these will shoot out, and they will strike the wall. They will convert to a red particle, and they'll give a single burst of kind of these fragments going. So we're going to get this continuous string of red particles wherever it was struck. So I think we can do something pretty fun with that. So I'm going to save this scene file. And instead of this surface here being this singular block, why don't we turn it into a more complicated mesh? So here's my thought. Let's feed that collider into a volume builder and then feed that into a volume mesh. I'll hit NB so I can actually see the subdivisions. And I want there to be more detail than that. So in my volume builder, I'll drop it to 5. Maybe a little bit more. We'll say 3. I want to keep it not overly detailed so it doesn't take too long to run. Excellent. So that's working well. Now, let's move the collider up to the volume mesh. That's what it's actually colliding with. Now, everything we just did should be working fine. If I hit play, the particles should still collide off of it exactly as we were just seeing, and everything's behaving the exact same way because that is the collider. But here's my thought. Every time we make a red particle, I want to take a little bite out of this pillar. How do we do that? Well, we've got this volume builder. Let's drag in the end result of the particle striking it, which is collided into the volume builder. Now, do not drag the particle in as a child, because if you turn off the volume builder and measure, it'll stop calculating that group. So instead, just remote link into it. Drag it directly in like this. Now, you'll see that immediately it is acknowledging those particles and is making them as a little bump on the outside. So right away, that's pretty cool. We could, in theory, start stacking up a bunch of these particles. If I hit play, let's just see what happens. I'm going to let this continue. You see we get a bump and a bump and a bump. But every time a new bump is created, that is a new bit of surface. And that new surface can be collided with by a particle. So we can get a bunch of buildup on top of here. So that could be pretty cool. But I think I want the opposite effect. I want this to be subtractive. So instead of the collided being a union, I'm going to say the collided is subtracting from the surface. And we can set the exact radius. It could also be based off the particle size, which could be pretty cool. But let's just see how the size of this is. So when a bullet comes flying out, then hopefully we're going to see that it's a little bit slower even on my viewport to calculate. When that goes and strikes the surface, it's going to create a little sphere, and that is a bite out of the surface. So let's zoom on up on that. So now you can see there's a divot in there. It's updated the geometry. Now, these red particles, we wouldn't render those. We could just have those little bits of fragment come out, and that would be damage from the wall. So now if I let this continue, we're going to keep on shooting more and more bullets, and the bullets are doing damage to the pillar. Once there's a hole, a new particle can strike that geometry and make an even deeper hole. Now we're going to keep getting a bigger and bigger pile of these red particles, and they'll just live there forever, constantly subtracting more and more. And as we fire more bullets into this pillar, it's just going to get more and more damage. So immediately this starts making you think of like the first Matrix movie, where we can just keep doing more and more damage to this pillar. Now there's a lot of polygons on there, And while recording and whatnot, this is running slower than some of my tests had gone, but this effect is very cool. We could definitely increase the geometry to have this be more detailed. I can fire more bullets out to have those go faster. We can make more fragments be flying out. Everything could have gravity getting applied to it. Oh, look, we finally blasted a hole through the pillar entirely. So blasted right on through. And now every subsequent bullet that hits that spot is going to fly right through it. So very fun way of using the reproduce and of being able to take bites out of geometry and constantly update the collision. Since we're already here, why don't we make it look a little bit better by adding a little bit of geometry in here? So when that burst of particles comes out, I think that we should probably have some gravity applied there. So let's add a gravity. And this gravity will apply to, not collided, but to the resulting explosion that comes from there. So I'll drop that under the collide. So hopefully these little pink particles, and actually let's change the color of those just so we can see them better. Let's make those a bright yellow. And I'll increase the radius so we can see them better. So these little yellow particles are going to burst, and now they've got gravity applied. Now, maybe we make that gravity a little bit weaker. But let's see, we get the first collision, get a little indent, and yeah, we get that burst of particles, and they fall down. Now, maybe we want to give them a little bit of time before they fall away, but I think that works pretty well. And let's create I think actually we want to shrink those. And you can do something pretty cool to shrink them. Let's show their radius. And inside of the particle, you can see that is their current radius of 1. And I want them to keep on shrinking more and more as they get older. Now, we have limited their life. The reproduce, they're only going to live for 7 frames. Let's have them live for 8 frames with 4 frames of variation. So as short as 4, as much as 12. So they have, every particle has its own lifetime that they can live. So if we were to make a data mapper, drop that inside of that reproduce, I'm going to say, I want to take your age, not age actually, but your age percentage from 0 and remap it from 0 to 100% to what? Well, I want to remap that to the radius. So I'm going to say when your age is 0, so when you're brand new, your radius will be 1. And then when you're at the end of your life at 100%, your radius will be 0. So they kind of shrink into nothingness. They'll just kind of visually disappear. And let's make sure this line is linear so they don't grow and then shrink again. So spline preset linear, straight line going across, and let's see what happens. Hit play from scratch, and let's take a look at those yellow particles and see if they get smaller as they get older. So we get a burst of particles, boom, and then they start falling, and as they fall, they get smaller and smaller and smaller based on their age. So the ones that are bigger are going to live for a little bit longer, and then more bursts will come in. So, okay, excellent. That's working very nicely. Now, let's make a cloner. And the cloner will be set to object mode. The object will be this particle group reproduce. We could even rename that to be like, I don't know, like chips or something. The chips coming out from this pillar. And in the cloner, I'll drag that in. I want to take on the particle scale. So yes, please. And let's just feed in some geometry. So, I mean, we can keep it fast and simple. Just make a cube. Set the size to 1, 1, 1. Actually, if the radius is 1, does that match or not? I mean, it's fine. We can make it a little bit bigger, but you see we get these little cubes now. The cubes are taking on the rotation, they're taking on the color, they're taking on the scale. So all that is working very nicely. We could now say, hey, don't worry about drawing the radius because we actually see it via the cubes. We're going to get these little bursts and explosions of the actual geometry falling away. So exactly what I want. And in this case, I could probably even visually hide these particles. And if we were to render this, remember, tell them not to render as well. So now we don't even see the particles. We just see the actual cubes bursting away from the wall. So excellent. Now, those could be taking on the color. Those could even be potentially taking on the color of the wall based on the vertex map. There's a lot of things we could be doing. But that's working well. We got the holes getting dug in. We could put a bullet in there, but you can see how we could start layering these things up. And that's where it gets really exciting. And making a more complicated model here, I think is totally possible, but I'll have to wait until I get my new machine to do something like that. So that is the Collide. Moving into another new scene file, we've got PyroAddVect. Here's one of my practice files. And again, it's not going to be super quick, but I'm now using a burst of pyro coming out from this plane. And you see I made a bunch of particles here, and they got tiny little tracers on them. And I actually visually hid a bunch of the pyro. And all I did was make a lovely, simple PyroAddVect, and it's taking on the forces of the pyro cloud passing through it. You can see that it's creating this great swirl traveling through. So very simple to implement, just like the Collide. You just create the PyroAddVect, you drop it inside your particle group, and it will now respect the fire that's being created. This one's running a little bit faster because I think I I must have turned off like tons of the settings in Pyro as far as not showing pretty much anything. But yeah, you can see you get really cool, like liquidy swirls from that. So very fun. And I look forward to playing with that more when I can get a better frame rate on it. Let's move on to stick. In a new scene file, I will start with creating a sphere. Nice and simple. Right-clicking on that, I'll add an animation tag, vibrate, and I want to affect the position. So we'll say, yeah, about 100 is good. So change those numbers, and I'll slow it down significantly, let's say 0.5. And I'd like this to spin a bunch, so I'll set it to 720 and put that in all 3 rotations and drop the frequency way down. So if I hit play, I've got a sphere that's moving around and it's spinning all over the place. Now, let's create an emitter with a bunch of different colors because we'll be able to see it better. So in this case, it'd be kind of fun to make, let's keep it simple. I'll make a basic emitter and do my favorite circle, rotate that to be pointing upward, move it way down. And in this case, let's say that it's going to, constantly emit particles. We can give them varying speeds if we like. So let's say up to 55 different. The direction is fine. Under color, we'll set that to random and load a preset. And let's get the full rainbow because why not? Hit play. And now we're going to get a bunch of particles. Let's make them bigger so we can see them a little bit nicer. And we got particles all flying up doing their thing. Okay, we need more frames. And we need to add a collider tag to our sphere. So simulation, collider. What do we need to actually make these stick? Well, we just need the stick modifier. Drop that under particle group. And now, as this runs, the particles are going to strike the sphere and they're going to stick. Now, earlier in this video, hours ago at this point, we were talking about colliders and the connectors and where a fixed connector was kind of like loose. But if you look, these particles are sticking perfectly to the surface. It's so good. Look at them just perfectly coating this thing. So yeah, we could cover this whole thing in like candy if we want to. And it's just moving around with this piece of geometry. So very pleased with that. Now, there are a bunch of settings here. I mean, it's actually one of the more straightforward ones. But you can see that we've got a radius. So we could be saying that these are striking from a much greater distance. If we continue this, you'll see these new ones are going to be sticking from further away. Actually, that's not even true. I think that they instantly stick to the surface. It's just the distance in which they've detected the object and then they suddenly snap to it. So you could make a smaller radius, but they'll always look like they're sticking perfectly to that surface. Next up is kind of a strange one. And that is we can lower the strength down. So let's start this over again and say that these are only sticking 10% to the surface. If I hit play now, these particles are going to go up and you see they are going to stick, but look at them be all kind of wiggly wobbly on top of the sphere. Like, look how funky that is. I'm not even sure how I would make an animation that was doing something like that. And keep in mind, we could always hide the original sphere. So we get this kind of weird blob taking on the shape as the different bits stick on there. So that's pretty fun by itself. Now, all of these particles are getting the condition of being stuck, and they will, I think, forever be stuck. Even if I turn off the stick, you're going to see that those are still stuck to it. They've been told, okay, you're stuck to this object. So how do we unstick them? Well, we have to make a different condition to make an unstick. We could also do a different condition to change the strength. Right now, they're very loosely connected, but we could change the strength to be very strongly connected. So in this case, why don't we make a slightly fancier condition than we've been doing in the past? I'm going to make a time condition, drop it under our particle group, and say, if the time is less than or equal to, and let's give it a little bit of time to collect some particles. So we'll say like 222. So that is when these are going to stick. But now, if I make another condition, I can drop this as a child of this condition. You can actually you can layer and layer and layer conditions on top of each other. So right now, this means if particle group and this time condition is met and this condition is met, do whatever the child is. So, and you can keep on layering more and more and more. And you see right now they're combining with an and. But on this new condition, I'm going to say, don't combine with an and. Instead, you are the inverse. And you see all the other properties went away. And all this is now doing is saying, when this condition isn't met anymore, this one starts getting met. So that means I can duplicate my stick and say unstick at that time. So as soon as we've swapped from the time of 222, we are now above it, which means we will unstick from it. So I'll rename this to unstick just so it's nice and clear. So now let's run that again from scratch. Bunch of particles flying up. As they strike the surface, they are sticking and they're going to stick until right around 222. And right at that moment, suddenly it lets go of everything. They go flinging away, and nothing else is going to connect to that surface. So we have the ability to change how sticky they are. Let's try changing the stickiness, actually. I'll say stick 100% on there. And let's run that again. I've actually never done a change strength, so I'm just curious what it looks like. So right now they are all wiggly again. And stick, stick, sticks. And then suddenly, boom, you see they all just got stuck directly to the surface. So yeah, very different behaviors. Now, of course, we can do things like, let's go back to the original. We don't need to unstick them now. Right now, we're sticking to them. We can change the radius. So that will make them stick from further away. Of course, it snaps right to the surface. And every time they get stuck, we could have them change to a different group. So just like when we collided, we could change the group. When they stick, we could change them to a different group. So suddenly they could be in a brand new group that's changing their radius or something like that. And of course, we got some pretty straightforward settings as far as including or excluding certain colliders. So right now we're colliding with that sphere, and we could say, well, there's two spheres, ignore one of them, include the other. So that should work pretty well. And we can also click this button that's going to jump to the objects that it is actually colliding with. So pretty straightforward, but that is the stick modifier, and we're down to only one more. Let's close down all these files. Boop, 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 boop. Now for the last of our 4 collision-based modifiers. This effect is going to be sort of like putting a car in a wind tunnel, but in order to keep the frame rate as high as I can, we're going to keep it nice and simple with a sphere. And on the sphere, we'll put a simulation collider, and then I need a emitter. Basic emitter here, scoot it back on Z, and I think I want a tall, thin sliver of particles. So make this nice and tall, and on X, I'll put 0. So if I hit play, we're going to get a constant stream of particles shooting forward. So in the particle group, we'll make them bigger, and I like changing them to have lots of different colors just because it's easier to tell what each particle is doing. So I'll say random and set that to my gradient. All right, cool. Lots of different random colors. And you know what, just to see it even better, let's grab our particle group, click the tracer, and say limit from end 22. And now we can get some little tails so we can see exactly what they're doing. Now, a lot of this effect we're going to be doing from the side view. So if I middle mouse button click, I can go to the side view and we see all these particles flying straight across. This time we are using surface attract. And I have to say, of all these different modifiers, this is the one I find the least intuitive, just personally. It feels a little bit more art than science. So let's just play around and see what we can get it to do, because it does some pretty cool things. So let's drop it inside our particle group and go to surface attract, and you can see it's already looking for simulation tags, so it's already seeing the sphere. So if we were to just hit play right now, let's see what happens. So you got a bunch of particles floating forward, and as they approach the sphere, you suddenly see they start taking on sort of the surface orientation. They start traveling around it. Let's give ourselves a few extra frames. You see these travel around, and they'll even sort of start continuing around the entire thing. Now, the first thing I want to do is make sure that we are not traveling off axis. You can see these are flying off thanks to the surface. So we'll prevent that with a math, drop that inside, and we are going to assign on position X already 0 constantly. So it's going to be a flat plane. So let's run that again, and we'll see that those X's are now no longer escaping. And that's the last thing that's happening. Okay, now that that's happening, go back to our side view, and now we don't have any of those crazy ones drifting around. And you'll see we get that nice whipping around of this object. In our surface attract, we can go and increase our radius, so it's a little bit further, perhaps, from the sphere. And now you can definitely see them start to travel around the entire thing. So some, these go down, and now they want to continue traveling around, which is a neat effect. But if we want to do sort of a wind tunnel effect, that's not quite what I'm expecting. And maybe it's not fair to expect it to do that automatically. Now, there's a couple other settings. We have attract and land, but we'll get to those in a moment. We've got the radius, and already you can see as we increase the radius, the effect will be applied from further. And then we've got strength. Now, strength can be interesting in this context. If we start lowering the strength, you're going to see, actually, we'll start it again, as these drift in, that they are going to get affected, but not quite as much. And now they are able to kind of pass around the back a little bit better. So maybe that's the key to the effect that I want to do here. I will increase the radius even further. So maybe they start drifting away from the surface here, the leading edge, a little bit more. Now, what's interesting here, I'm not quite sure what to make of it, is that some of these particles will travel downward even though they're above, or I think that the surface that they'd be closest to would want them to go upward, not downward. Now, if we turn on randomize, that seems to really crank up the number of them that will travel down rather than up, so a lot more chaos when they decide which direction they're going. But I'm not quite sure why some of them decide to travel downward. So just a question mark I've got there. So these are traveling around pretty well. I'm pleased with the way those are looking now overall. Now, An effect I have found that increases the quality of this effect actually is, instead of having these all just travel via their built-in velocity, what if we start draining out their velocity via friction? So we'll drop that before the math. I'll say math.x just to know that that's flattening that whole thing. So with a little bit of friction here, you see they're constantly losing their speed and slowing down. So that's fine. Now I want to give them back their speed with a wind. It's already blowing in the right direction. So we'll set that up to something like 55. Is that good? I might want to go faster. Let's even go up to about 100. So now we've got all those traveling forward now. And what's happening now is, instead of them just having their own velocity, there's a wind that's always telling them to try and go further backward. You see, we get a little bit better curvature on the back here, and the energy is constantly being drained out, but the wind is telling it to go backwards again. So I feel like the wind tunnel effect is a little bit better, and honestly more accurate, because now there is a wind constantly blowing everything backward. Now, potentially we could do fall offs where we say that the wind is going to be a lot stronger back here. But personally, I think I found a pretty cool trick where we can use a blend. If I use this blend, one of the settings, one of the properties is velocity. And that's just the direction it's moving, like all of its motion. So if we give that a relatively large radius, and a strength of 50%, I have found is pretty good, as they start traveling, they are adapting the direction that each of them are traveling, like their overall movement. That might confuse it a little bit in the beginning, so we might want to modify that. But now as they travel backward, as this group from the bottom and the group from the top start approaching each other, they're going to blend into each other, and we get a lot more of this leveled out movement where they're not fighting each other as much, and immediately they take on that direction again. So there are things we could do condition-wise. I'm not sure how old these particles get, but potentially, actually, we can probably do a position. Right now, these particles are being born back on negative z. So if we make a condition, one we haven't used yet, we'll say condition, and the condition is for this blending, and I want the wind before the friction, and then we want the blend in the condition. So the condition is going to be when the position of z equals, or I'm going to say greater than or equals 0. So right there is the threshold for 0 to be positive. So these aren't going to start trying to blend until these particles have gone beyond that point. So I've never tried this before, but let's see how that works. Hitting play, let me deselect so the condition is not highlighting them or delighting them perhaps. Now we can see that those are not being forced to blend together, and now those will blend, and hopefully it'll be pretty smooth. And as these travel around to the back, now, oh yeah, look at that nice transitions. Oh, okay, this is the best version of this I've ever gotten, so I like the way that that's looking. Now, potentially we could use some sort of different attractors, or we could use some forces to push these away from the surface a little bit. But from a 3D point of view, I think that these would just kind of do a nice job of traveling around the entire thing, especially if we hid the original particles and we're just looking at those tracers. Like, that's doing a pretty nice job of giving a flow around the entire object. So I'm pleased with that. So keep that in mind. In fact, this is a really good version, so I will save this one because it's working better than any of the other ones I've gotten to work. Now let's take a look at some of the other settings that we have inside of the surface attract. Now, we do have the radius, we've got strength, we also have damping. So this would essentially add some additional friction for the particles that are getting close to the surface. So essentially you'll slow down when you're near that surface. So potentially that is a useful one. We already saw that randomized seemed to send more particles up or down, the opposite of what you would intuitively think they are. And then we've got a straightforward apply object velocity. So if this sphere was moving, those particles would take on its movement and probably rotation. Now, as soon as something gets within this radius, we can have something change its target group, which is pretty powerful, just being able to have that simple radius around an object. That might be a cool way of building a condition based on just being in the radius and get rid of all the strength. So keep that in mind for the future for changing groups. The ability to change a group essentially is a super condition that you can do anything with from that point forward. And of course, we can exclude any simulation objects. If we hit select geometry, then it will select anything that is currently in the scene that it is affecting. Now, let's look at our other modes as well. So right now, that is our follow the surface, but let's change this to be an attract. So we still get that large radius, and I'll crank up our strength to be really high. And let's see what we get now. So if I hit play, keep in mind that we've got kind of a modified scene here that the wind is constantly blowing to the back. So that's going to change things. But what I found is I don't find attract very intuitive. Let's go and turn off wind and the friction. So we're still stopping on Z. And let's just look at the way this behaves. What this is supposed to do is attract to kind of the nearest point of the surface. So you see these start curving down towards the surface, but then they kind of start whipping back up again. And maybe that makes sense where they've kind of passed through and maybe they're looking forward and that's the next most forward point. So they kind of drift upward. But I don't have a great intuition for that one. But if you start adding some damping in there, actually, as soon as you hit kind of a threshold, you're going to see we have a very different effect where everything starts slowing down and then drifting towards the surface. So depending on that level of damping, that can actually give you some pretty cool effects where it's going to try and get attracted directly to the surface. A very different effect, but pretty neat. Now, that might work in combination with land, but land is the one I find maybe least intuitive. If I activate land, you're going to see that, well, actually at 100%, it's going to be weird because suddenly the particles are going to get snapped straight to the surface. As soon as they're within the radius, they're finding the nearest possible surface and just snapping straight to it. But if we lower our strength down really weak, let's say like 5%, we still get sort of a weird effect. It is going to move within the radius, but as soon as it's in the radius, you see we suddenly get this hard change of direction where they're just stopping, moving towards the direction and moving straight towards the surface. So potentially that could be fine, that could work. But that sharp change in direction is what's throwing me off. Now, I'm going to take this blend out of there, and I wonder if that could actually smooth those out. Nope, the blend is not strong enough to counteract this surface attract just blatantly changing their direction. So again, a kind of a cool effect, but that straight change there, instead of there being some sort of transition, again, throws me off a bit. We can put some damping on there, but that doesn't change that harsh transition. They will lose their energy as they get near the surface. And, again, a pretty cool effect. You can see the way those look. And I did think I found that if we have a small radius, if we keep on slowly increasing our radius, you can kind of get this cool stair-steppy effect where more and more particles are going to be attempting to change their direction and get attracted to the surface. Maybe I want that to be a little bit stronger there. So yeah, those are getting pulled towards the surface now. Oh, I clicked on the track. Apologies. So yeah, if we drop the stair-steppy effect down, and we keep on increasing that radius, we can kind of get these cool effects where you get like these waves of them traveling in. So I think there's a lot of cool effects here, but yeah, I find I just play around with the sliders until I get something that looks cool, where the other ones, I feel like I really understand them. So yeah, this one definitely worth a lot more exploring. I think there's a lot more possibilities for what it can do, but the ability to take on some of the surface properties is another great tool in this tool belt. Let's close down this file and move into a brand new one because there are sort of a couple of global settings I think that we should talk about. The first thing is under simulate, we've got our simulation scene. So if you were to make like a basic emitter and drop that inside of that simulation scene, instead of using these global parameters under, say, particles, it's going to use these local ones in the simulation scene. And that means I could make a duplicate of that, make a completely separate particle system over here, and these two scenes, these simulation scenes, won't interact with each other. So you can always do that and change local settings. So keep that in mind. I just don't do it very often because almost always I want all my particles to interact. In addition to that, let's go to those global settings. Under simulation, you go specifically to particles and you'll see substeps, although I've got a little demo I'm going to show you that will demonstrate that even better, but you can make the particles have even more calculations by doing substeps on them. Change your precision from 16 and 32, and then we've got these two settings called initial capacity and compactify threshold. So very weird terms, but essentially what this is saying is you've got a certain capacity of particles, and it's keeping all of those particles in the memory inside of Cinema, inside of that simulation engine. So what this is saying, if you have more than 20% of your particles are essentially dead, it's going to try and recycle those. So essentially it'll store extra particles in your scene that you don't need because the deletion of those particles is a pretty major calculation hit. So very technical terms, but that's erasing out unneeded particles. And potentially you might want your compactify to be happening constantly and refresh and delete them. Or you might want to say, hey, never compactify. You want to keep all those particles. So I haven't run into that yet, but it's something to keep in mind. We got selection highlighting, so you could stop anything from highlighting. And finally, you got groupless particles. So if you have a groupless particle, it's going to display as this crazy pink color. Man, I'm starting to lose my voice after all of this recording. Now let's create any one of these emitters. And now we have our particle group. And you'll see inside your particle group, you have a cache. So we can actually cache these particles. We can cache them. We can actually cache them to Alembic, or we can cache them internally in the scene. And after we've cached them, you see that we can actually do things like use animation, do offsets, or change the speed, or we can do some time remapping, which is great and really powerful. A couple of things to note. As I mentioned a long time ago, this particle system has a separate simulation engine sort of running separately from regular cinema and the viewport. So what that means is you do end up with certain limitations where, for instance, you cannot render to your viewport. You can't do, let me actually correct myself. You can't render to the viewport renderer unless you've baked your particles, because the simulation is kind of happening in that separate engine before it comes back. So once you bake it, it's fully here within Cinema. So definitely something to keep in mind. Always keep in mind that we've got these particles, and once they're baked, you can do some cool things. At the point that they're baked, maybe I can open up a scene file or even do something really straightforward here, where if we make some particles, yeah, we've already got an emitter. Let's aim this upward. And we can just shoot some particles up into the air. And yeah, actually, they're doing their thing just fine. So I'm just going to leave that like that. So let's bake this scene. So let's say cache the scene. So it wants me to save this somewhere. This is fine. Say save. Oh, I guess I give it a name. Terrible name. I would say test. And now that's baking out my simulation. And now that that's baked out, I am able to see that that is indeed cached. We're ready to go. It is actually, I guess, just a straight up Alembic cache, which is kind of interesting. But now that it is baked, we've got these particles. But what's cool is we can do things like make a deformer. We can make a twist deformer and drop it as a child and start increasing this. And you can see I can actually twist those particles around. So if I were to grab the end result of that, put a tracer on there and say start tracing that, we're actually going to get a twisting effect. So once it's baked, we're able to do things like deformers on top of it. Now, you don't necessarily need to or want to use the baking process here. I can clear out that cache and we can run the simulation. But that same deformation, this twist is not going to apply on top of it. Where as I increase this twist, you see those particles did not move. But we do have still some alternatives where we could maybe do something like create a matrix object, tell the matrix to clone onto an object. The object will be the particle group. So now I've got all those matrix clones. So with those matrix clones now existing, I can deform those matrix objects. So this time I didn't cache, but I'm able to grab a twist, drop that inside the matrix, twist those around, and you see those are now twisting, and say, okay, matrix, I want you to have a tracer attached, and those will get twisted. So now when I hit play, we're still getting that twisting effect. Keep in mind that that deformed part is now, it's kind of like when you run a dynamic simulation on top of particles, like the simulation kind of becomes a separate thing. It's like, yeah, they spawn from the same spot and they have the same lifetime and color, but they're not in the same place anymore. So yeah, these are no longer in that same place. So just a couple of important details there. So those are some global settings. What I would like to do is go through a couple of my project files. We are not going to rebuild these, although during live streams, these are great examples of things that we could tinker around with. Now, one thing I suggest everybody does when you're playing with any new particle system in any software, that is try and make a fireworks explosion. Like make a big old fireworks celebration, and it's a good way of just kind of stretching the muscles of that tool. So here you can see I've got all these particles flying in the air, exploding, burst. We got these trails, we got these swirls coming below. It was really fun to put this together, and these will just go forever with random colors. So this did a lot to teach me how to spawn these, reproduce these children particles, and how to inherit the color and all these different variables. And look at how simple this hierarchy is. We've got the initial burst of particles, which are living for a set amount of time and generating a certain color. And I actually have them spinning around a random degree. And those particles spinning around is what enables me to spit out a bunch of particles as these swirling tails. Let's rewind to clean it up a little bit. And then we've got the initial particle that's going to travel up and eventually explode. That's this burst, so it makes a burst of particles. And those particles are then also reproducing thanks to these burst tails, and those are leaving those little trails behind. And every single one of these have settings where they are doing things like inheriting the color of it. 69% of the color of that burst particle is being put into the tail. And if we go back up to the burst, you can see 100% of the color of the initial firework is getting transferred over to the burst. So yeah, a lot of fun things you can do. I'm using a lot of data mappers here where I'm remapping the radius based on the age. I'm remapping the color alpha channel, so these fade out. This entire thing was set up to render. Actually, let me see if I can pop open that render. So here it is. Here's the fireworks, not the highest resolution, but this rendered pretty quick, all in Redshift. So you can see these bursting effects, lots of bloom and flares and whatnot. So a fun one to put together. Definitely recommend everybody tinkers around with some fireworks at some point. Moving on. This one is very exciting. I wish we had more time to go over it, but this is mostly just using flocking and collide. You can see I made a bunch of these steps, and the flocking is telling the particles to push apart from each other. So if I hit play right now, it's going to make a burst of particles. They all spread out, and this is making a very simple liquid effect where the particles want to hang out near each other, but they want to also push apart from each other, and gravity is making them flow down through here. And you see we get this nice flowy kind of oozing motion. Now, one thing to point out is there's so many particles stacking on top of each other. These are getting really squished in there. But if you go into your global settings and I change my substeps up to 1, just changing one number there, watch this cluster right here. When I hit play again, there's suddenly going to be kind of a burst as those push their way back out again. And that is now a lot cleaner. They're not squished nearly as much. They are still squished a little bit. So I have found if you go up to 3, then they're going to push out again. And at 3, it doesn't really feel like there's much compression going on anymore. Now they are pretty accurate and they don't feel like they're getting squished in there too much. And you get all this really fun flowing action. Now, again, you see this is 2-dimensional, and I definitely recommend when you're playing around, whenever you can, do things 2-dimensionally. It just removes a big variable, and instead of making a giant liquid simulation, I can just do this little cross section of it and get way quicker testing. So another fun thing to do. Much like that cartoony explosion you saw earlier, here, let me turn that off, update my redshift. If I hit play, we get a burst of particles and a long tail of particles all being fed through a volume mesher. And what we end up with here, let this go, you get this cartoony tail, and the flocking is letting these cluster up in these little blobs. So you get these nice little anime smoke effects going on. So very fun. You don't even have to do too much, a little turbulence, a little bit of flocking, and you can get effects like this. So we can break that down more during a live stream. Moving on, here's just some fun. Oh yeah, this is definitely one I want to mention. Very simple setup, stuff that we've seen before, but this time I've got this plane highly subdivided, and in that plane, I've got a vertex color map, and you can drag the particle group into a vertex map, and you can actually extract the colors. So if I hit play right now, you can see I get all of these crazy colors going, and here they are represented in my vertex map. If I then activate this decay, it's going to draw a little tail behind them. So it's a way of translating those particles directly onto a mesh via the vertex color map. So yeah, very fun along those lines. Next up, here is, actually, this is an old tutorial I made way back in the day. Actually, no, that's not. I want to explore this one a little bit more in the future. It's not quite working, but I like this effect where I got these little tails traveling, and it's drawing these little radiuses of different spheres behind it, depending on what the distance traveled was. But eventually this breaks down, and I start getting these like super wacky giant ones. So I got to like figure out what's going wrong with there, but I really like the effect overall. Next up, here was actually my earlier kind of like teaching myself what the surface attract was doing. Here it is traveling over a car. Now it's not actually viewing the mesh of the car, it's viewing this remesh I made. So a nice little poly version of it. But this one's not working as well as the one we just made, but you get some nice smooth trails behind it. So pretty cool. You can see how it works on a car. Next up, here is some field forces. Now, actually, this is one I'd love to talk about. Maybe we can save this one for the live stream. But if I hit play, we can get these cool twisting effects traveling around. Now, technically, you could actually do this effect with the old particle system, but it's so much better and more fun to use in the new system. So yeah, we should definitely go and explore that one. Next up, we've got, which one is this? Oh, this one's going to run really slow. But what I'm doing is making some growing vertex maps. So I got this vertex map, we got some curves, and eventually there's going to be some growing effects traveling on here. Yeah, here's the freeze set to grow. So it's going to grow this vertex map over the entire surface. And as it's growing, this poly effects is dissolving out the polygons. And I'm able to emit particles from only where the vertex maps were. So we get this cool burning rainbow effect traveling along the surface, and eventually the entire thing will dissolve. But you see, even here in my viewport, this one's not running terribly well. So, new computer all the way. But yeah, pretty cool effect. And the polygons are dissolving behind it, sort of invisibly behind all of these. So yeah, very cool effect. And I look forward to exploring that some more. And we got 2 little ones to go. We've got these tail guides. So let's see what I got. Oh, okay. So this one is a really old effect I made. Oh, no, this isn't what I thought it was. Okay, this one is weird. I need to explore this more. It's kind of weird where I'm emitting a burst of particles and I've got these tracers coming behind it. But then I'm using some really strong field forces to tell it to follow those. And what I do is I do a giant burst of particles, and those particles via a field force want to follow where these guide splines are going. So you can see you get this organic blob where things want to branch out and travel along. And doing some fun vertex map magic, I can get these colorful blobs all kind of transitioning. So like a nice bright colorful mesh flowing in all these directions, completely organic. Like I don't know what direction that's going to go. So yeah, pretty fun there. Want to explore it some more. And finally, using some of the flocking behaviors, this is just a big ball, a burst of particles and a volume mesher. And as they continue to go further and further out, eventually the flocking is attracting a whole bunch of the particles to each other. And we kind of get this nuclear explosion effect, where as it gets bigger and bigger, you start getting these little holes forming in it. And the holes will spread further and further out until finally everything kind of coalesces in these little ropey shapes. So yeah, this looks like the exploding top of the mushroom cloud. So pretty cool effect to be able to recreate pretty easily here with a new particle system. Now, I feel like we could keep on going and going and going for hours, and I'm worried that this video is already, I'm not exaggerating, I'm worried this video might be 4 hours long. I might have to break it into multiple parts, but you'll know by the time you've seen this. I don't right now as I record it. So I think I am finally going to have to wrap this one up. A huge thank you to everybody who has made it to the end of the video, whether you were skipping around or watched all 4 hours straight through. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video and this content, be sure to support it by liking, maybe subscribing, whatever you want to do. That's always appreciated. And of course, I have a Patreon set up to support being able to make these videos. I've spent the better part of a month learning and preparing for this video, so it does eat up a lot of my time. Now, as I mentioned, there's a new Rocket Lasso sale going on right now during NAB. You get 25% off any of our tools, so always great to go and check that out. Make sure to check out EJ's video to see all the new Redshift stuff. Obviously, I couldn't make this video even longer. At 4 hours, it's almost double any of my other tutorials, so absolutely crazy along those lines. And yeah, I think that's going to wrap it up. Be sure to check out the live stream today if you're watching this video when it's brand new. I guess you'd probably have to skip out of the video because it's too long, so you wouldn't see this part before the live stream. But again, thank you so much, everybody, for tuning in. It's always very appreciated, and I'll see you during the live stream. Bye-bye, everybody.